Okay, fantastic. Let's get going. I'm going to introduce you to the basics of sketchnoting in 15 minutes, which is quite a challenging um, task to do. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Yuri. What I do is I am an agile coach, and that's my full-time job. And when I have some spare time, not being an agile coach and not spending time with my family, I do a lot of visual thinking and sketchnoting. That's my passion, and I guess I qualify well for the honorable title of visual agilist. And thanks, guys, for having me over. It's an honor to be here with you. And the way we're going to discover the world of sketchnoting, and in my understanding, the best way to talk and discuss the topic is to demonstrate instead of just talking. So I'll be sketchnoting my talk on sketchnoting, right? And first thing you want to learn about sketchnoting is that you don't need to be worrying much about you being slow. So right now I'm writing down the title of my talk, and most commonly people get stressed because you don't write or draw as fast as you speak, and sometimes it's intimidating and it makes people feel uncomfortable, but you just need to get used to that and be okay with that. You don't have to be super fast, as long as you're effective. So that's first thing you learn about the technique. It's not to stress you out, but to help you out and to help you have fun and enjoy the process. So as I said, sketchnoting is a technique. So we will start by talking about what kind of a technique is that. So I'm using a smaller writing here, and I'll be talking about the technique in this part of the paper. And as Pavlo said, feel free to just follow along and copy what I'm doing. It's also a better idea to learn sketchnoting by doing. So how this technique works is that there's a person, hopefully you, if you like the idea of sketchnoting, holding maybe a pencil, a pen, a marker, whatever allows you to leave a mark on the surface. And that person is probably leaving the marks on paper like I'm doing right now, but that could also be a digital device for that matter. Any material that allows you to create a spatial representation. And I will get back to spatial many times, representation. So what that means is that something that allows you to create an overview of things on the two-dimensional space. And when do you use this sketchnoting technique? Is when, for example, you hear something. Like you are in a meeting, or you are in attending a conference or a training session, so you're hearing a lot of information. And that information is received by you in a linear format of a language coded message. So it's a lot of word after word after word, and then your brain translates that into meanings. So you hear that information, you try to arrange the things that you hear about on that two-dimensional space by just sketching and drawing. Well, I will use the word sketch, so we try to avoid a word draw as much as possible, because a lot of people might say, well, I cannot draw, so we will not talk about drawing. And then when you organize stuff on paper or digitally, what happens is that you now, additionally to hearing this information, you begin to see this information. So you see this information, and inside of your head something is happening. So your brain is processing a lot of information. There is a lot of thinking and processing happening. And now you are enhancing the process by hearing and translating that into meanings, and then seeing that. And suddenly this process becomes more effective, more robust. And if you do it right, if you do not put too much stress on yourself, it also becomes more fun working this way. And if we look closer into what constitutes a sketch note, if we just double click there and try to peek into what a sketch note could be, basically it's anything that is organizing information on a piece of paper or digitally, where you have different types of concepts organized in a way that you can, by looking at things, understand how concepts are related to each other. Basically, this here is my sketchnoting of explaining the technique, which is nothing more just a spatial organization of how different pieces of information appear here. And I was drawing as I was talking, but equally so, I could be note-taking in this manner someone talking about this topic. And I arrived at this spatial representation of what I heard by combining drawings and pictures and texts together. And right now, if it's the simplified version of what you see here, where you can see buckets of pieces of information that now you can analyze in an order that you prefer. So basically that's the sketchnoting. And I use the sketchnoting to explain the sketchnoting, and now we will reverse engineer the main components that constitute a successful sketchnote, basically. And I already showed you these components, but I will go through them one by one, components, so that we can talk about them individually and maybe learn a trick or two additionally. So the first main component we want to talk about is the spatial organization. And what that means is that the sketch note is always something that is spreading information in a two-dimensional space. And it always comes with the fact that you just simply start drawing things on paper or digitally. As long as you even randomly put concepts on the two-dimensional space, that triggers a different way for your brain to operate. There are some theories suggesting that the way the brain works is that it operates so-called mental models, which is nothing else but just a graph. So basically, when you put something on paper, like 5 circles here, you trigger a different mode of your brain operating, where it's probably operating with the more natural like representation of information. Instead of just hearing the artificial coding in language, you just tap into the inherent functions of your brain directly by showing something that is close to probably how the information is represented inside of it. So the first main component is just to place stuff on a piece of paper, even if it's a totally random organization. This fact alone triggers your brain to start working a bit differently. So that does the trick itself alone. So some people say, well, I don't know which composition should I use, what kind of organization on paper, and they get so stressed, and then it stops them from using sketchnoting because they have this fear of getting things wrongly, choosing the wrong composition. What I'm saying right now is that don't worry about that. Just even if you put stuff randomly, you already there gain some value for yourself. Now the next step is, or not step, basically a component. The next component is using all sorts of connections. So if you remember that statement about mental models, which are graphs, graphs are the connection between, it's a combination of concepts interconnected. So if you place stuff on a piece of paper, our brain will start thinking in terms of patterns, trying to understand, okay, how do these relate to each other, which parts are more important. And you can help it by either explicitly or implicitly suggesting connections. So there can be an implicit way of connecting things. For example, in this case, by just placing a person centrally and then organizing other parts around that person, you can kind of suggest a certain natural connection between these things. So we know that a thought bubble coming out of the head is probably a thought, and then the audio waves radiating is probably something related to hearing. So these are just implicit connections that allow us to hold these meanings together. But you could also use explicit connections, for example, dotted, dashed, solid lines, arrows of all sorts and styles, in order to explicitly establish connections between the meanings that you put to paper. So for example, you can say, okay, these two things are feeding into my head, and the product of my brain processing is something else. So keep in mind that the sketchnoting is heavy about connections, and don't forget to use them. The next thing we're going to talk about is using the texts. So a lot of people getting into visual thinking and sketchnoting in particular, they start drawing more than writing down, because writing down is looked down at, because it's all text. We want to get away from text. We want to draw more. But then a text can be a visual token, which is easier and faster than a drawing. So we shouldn't just cast that aside. And what is important about the text is that the meaning is translated by using the different size of text, but also sometimes using different style of text as well. So for example, you can drive attention to meanings and their priorities by just shifting between the size of text and their style. So in this case, there will be a less importance with this text, while there will be more perceivable importance with this text. The next big component to sketchnoting is icons. Icons are very important, and that is probably one of the hardest parts for newcomers to this type of technique, because a lot of people who work in so-called uncreative jobs, they state, I cannot draw. But there is a hack to it. You don't need to become an artist. You just need to learn how to draw several really simple icons, like a U meant to represent a person, a stack of U people denoting a team. You can just use simple shapes like squares and circles, and just slightly update them and turn them into smileys and buildings. And you can turn a triangle into a milestone icon. You can turn a diamond shape by just drawing some extra elements in order to create a pseudo 3D shape for a product. And sometimes you need to map emotional aspects, and all you need to do is just to remember what combination of simple strokes manifests a certain emotional expression. And then you can also remember that visual thinking and sketchnoting in particular is also effective through the use of frames and borders. So frames and borders. I will show you what that means. In my case, while the sketchnoting demonstration is almost done, it starts to mess up, because there is a lot of information, and now it becomes a bit difficult to navigate. Yes, I remember how the narrative developed, but for a person who sees that for the first time, it can be a bit difficult to understand what that is about. And then you can use frames and borders in order to alleviate the problem and make it easier to navigate through this visual clutter. So for example, if I draw a simple border like this, it will suggest a certain division between the meanings that were placed on the two-dimensional space. Drawing borders around titles gives them more visual meaning and value. And this is like an auxiliary technique, but it's very powerful, allowing you to organize the information that you're trying to share. And finally, when you work with digital media and when you work with paper, if you use some fancy tools I'm going to show you, you can also engage with colors to further allow you accentuate certain meanings. I use two colors when I work with paper and digital media, where you can choose colors. I use gray for shadows, and I use brilliant yellow for the highlights. I'll just quickly demonstrate you what that allows you to do. First, I use shadows when the sketchnoting is done, and I just want to accentuate the meaningful parts of the sketch note. And my rule of thumb is that I would apply shadows to everything that is presumably material, like a drawn object. Text is super abstract, I wouldn't give it a shadow, but if it's something like an icon, something that has a materialistic representation in real life, I would grant it a shadow. And I do that by just simply drawing a kind of a following shadow on the side, something like that. And sometimes I even give that to things like boxes and frames. So what happens, if you see what happens, it is as if the entire sketch note kind of popped up, and it's now making it easier to navigate because it allows you to separate meaningful parts or material part from the abstract parts like notes and titles. And it's easier to navigate, but also it makes it more what you call Instagrammable, because now you can take a snapshot and then impress your friends, right? And then highlights allows you to solidify the priorities by guiding the person's site through a predefined sequence. For example, if you want them to start here, you would place like more color here, and then they will guide to smaller titles, and then eventually to smaller colored pieces. And that is what exactly I would like to happen when I am reading this information or someone else is reading. I want to help them navigate, and therefore I use the color for that. So I know I overspent time a bit, and that was not planned, but that is pretty much the demonstration of technique. And I hope it gives you some good ideas about how you could use that. I also hope that some of you chose to follow along and maybe created your own versions of this sketchnoting demonstration. And I'm going to use these techniques when we get to Geoff's talk, and I hope that I can keep up with his fantastic presentation and create a nice sketchnoting for that.